turn, run the pipe and turn inside and you flip on your back, you've only got two options. Either, if you've got the time, you drive your shoulder down to put more weight on them, or you do a barrel roll and you grab over the top of their hips in the hope that their momentum in pulling you will actually pull them over your head. So what you're seeing in this moment is the moment when the defensive wrestler has turned that offense into his own and is attempting to drop his arse down so he flips over his head and he ends up on top. So it's an extremely specific position. Thank you very much.
Can I ask you both a question then? I've got lots of questions, but by reading that in relation to a specific set of attacking, defensive and counter-attacking moves, it's turning it into quite an accurate representation of a set of wrestling techniques. And yet when I think of Gaudier and modernism and avant-garde art, that's not what I think of. I think of something that I would expect to be an imaginative recreation and move away from any kind of verisimilitude. So can I ask you both what you think, from whatever point of view you like, about the relationship between recording a move and a kind of creative intervention?
I think this piece is particularly really interesting for thinking about those transitions between representation of the human form and abstraction. And actually, when you look at Redstone Dancer as well, perhaps you can think of that as a kind of the next step, or again, thinking about these works together. I think it's quite helpful for thinking about Gaudier's move into more and more abstract works. And I think particularly in that knot and tangle of limbs, that's where you see this sort of, perhaps it's a tension or a relationship between observation, and I think interest in the moves you're talking about and the techniques, and the kind of artistic desire to think about an abstract body as well, and about formal abstraction and how that then provides a new set of relationships for thinking about bodies together. And I think that's why this is such a complicated work actually, because when I look at it in different places and at different angles, I kind of see, sometimes I see, thinking about like observation and representation, and then other times I think, especially when I'm thinking about it in relationship to the other bodies, that's when I'm thinking about modernism and abstraction. I think that layering is very much apparent at different parts of that relief as well, and it's interesting to think where we start to look in this sculpture as well. Where do we look from above? Do we look underneath? Do we start with the head resting there? Are you drawn into that knotty tangle? So I think it's a tension, a slippage, an interrelationship between those things.
It's something I thought about a lot actually, because I came at it from the same perspective, to see the technique there so clearly and to really see that as the root, and actually see the other aesthetic decisions that he's made as the things that he's doing to make the representation more abstract. Really made me think about my own biographical experiences of teaching children. Children, when they fight, they wrestle. They don't punch each other. It's not a natural thing. Human hands especially are not designed for hitting, as you know, Len. They break very quickly. So when I watch children wrestle, what's really fascinating over the years that I've done that is that it's like watching a nature program when you watch bears wrestle. They're not trying to kill each other. They're trying to show dominance socially. So actually people's natural inclinations in terms of wrestling is wrong. It's the very worst thing to do, to try and hold someone or headlock them. And what I think really has come through so clearly in his experience from reading the source material that you were kind of share with me, is that he's seen that mastery of the natural instinct of grappling, which is a very natural thing. It's very close to sex and to hugging and these kind of physical, corporeal patterns we put on our lives. And because I started so young, really without choice, at 3 or whatever, I could only ever underhook when someone would hug me, or protect my neck when someone would be close to me. So there's these patterns that come through that you start to see the world through that technique. And the other way is lost, the natural movement. And I really felt that that's what happened, because the additional details, the way the faces are rendered, the way that the hands and feet are rendered, the fact that they're naked, To me, that seemed like the aesthetic moments, and actually what he saw was this beautiful instinctual mastery of one's natural desire to just scramble and headlock. So yeah, it's a very interesting point, because I thought of it too.
I was really interested when you were saying about hands and protecting hands, and I hadn't thought about this before, but as a sculptor, as an artist as well, people have often asked me about the hands in this piece as well. These sort of the spade, paddle, yes, and again you see those in Redstone Dancer as well, the paddles there. And thinking about protecting hands and the work that's a sculptor's hands, the build-up of muscle in them as well. So it just prompted me to think a bit more about that part of the relief.
There's something else as well that I think has been abstracted from this relief, and actually that is the sensual and the erotic. You said when we think of wrestling and art, we necessarily think of the homoerotic and sexuality and sensuality. Well, actually, I think it's remarkable for its kind of lack of sensuality. I think there's something incredibly matte and unerotic about it. I think in the letter that you quoted, where he sort of describes the bodies of the wrestlers, there is a kind of incredibly detailed observation that almost slips over into desire for the body of the wrestlers. But it seems to me that Redstone Dancer is more erotic than this.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you agree with me, both of you, why?
Well, I'd say I disagree a little bit, because I do see that point, especially on the left, where the head is resting there, and there's this almost trace of a smile or a smirk. That to me is the sensual. There's a sensuality to this relief. I read into it here, and it's focusing around that moment of touch there. Perhaps in the lino cut is where there's more of a sensuality or an erotics in the relationships, or the ambiguities of the relationships between those bodies, I think, in something like the lino cut. So I think I would slightly disagree, and just again thinking about this as quite a kind of a sort of piece of kind of many parts, and that's where I would focus on, to think about that sort of that moment of embrace coming down in that line from the head and the smile to those crossed hands there.
Steve, would you like to tell us how erotic is it to us? Extremely. I mean, I definitely am not qualified to speak in aesthetic terms. The only thing I would say is that a lot of the time when I'm teaching wrestling and involved in wrestling, that is something that is said, and something that a lot of wrestlers embrace, and the kind of camaraderie and humour that goes on. But also there is this other element to it, which, perhaps he's so close to the wrestlers doing what they're doing. What perhaps he's revealing here, which isn't sensual, away from the actual lines, away from the actual connection of the bodies, is that the experience of wrestling, like the experience of boxing, is horrific. There is no space for any sort of sensuality. It is the most phenomenologically, psychologically combative art, because there's no way to end it quickly, and all you've got is some, as I was a few days ago, Chechen wrestler with his head in my face, driving me to the wall, throwing me. Because I've always never been good enough to be good, so I've always been like just at that level where I train with good people and they just smash me all day long. It's good for the soul. But yeah, the eroticism, perhaps what he's capturing is that, because he speaks about that amazing contradiction in what you read, like whizzing people around their head.
Yeah.
Nothing erotic about that. But then he speaks about the supple body. So there's these two elements to it, and I think this maybe leans towards the more fantastical.
He's very much talking about their watching, isn't he? Watching, not doing. And you're just listening to you there, you're talking about doing. And I think that's something that's perhaps, this is, an art observed. I mean, Gaudier was a street fighter. There's in Eads and Savage Messiah, there's lots of talk about him fighting and engaging in fights with the costermongers in London, but it's an untrained fighting. This is different. I think these this watching in the gym of the wrestlers is, and I think that's an interesting. Just hearing you talk really made me think about Gaudier's relationship with these figures here.
Can I just pick up on that? You mentioned the reconstruction of the landscape of these wrestling gyms in Edwardian London. So I'm trying to I think it's beginning to become quite vivid of Gaudier going to these wrestling gyms and then going to fights. But can you sort of fill that out a bit more? What was this landscape like?
Yeah, well, I think they're quite. At the club that I mentioned where Gaudier's going, they're training wrestlers in different techniques as well, and that Steve mentioned. So there's sort of an interesting kind of those regional varieties. But do you mean the actual kind of physical space as well?
I think what I'm trying to imagine is why do artists?
Yeah.
I mean, there are lots of different reasons, but it's this moment where we can think of so many artists and writers who want to be part of the world of boxing and fighting, and you're right, it's ugly, it's violent, but they want a piece of it.
Yeah.
And why?
And it's interesting that when Gaudier's talking, he's talking about going to watching people train as well. And I've got no sort of hard evidence that he's paying to watch matches as well. So I think that thinking about being in the gymnasium, in a space of training, of education, of preservation as well. I think this idea of like preserving the regional sports, the wrestling, and doing that from these headquarters in London as well, Cornish wrestling in Lancashire as well, where I'm from, and those. So I think those kind of these hubs for thinking about preservation. But it is interesting, I think, back seeing a wrestling match, so going to the Inter-Empire Games under the hot, in that hot environment of the Crystal Palace would have been very different, that mass spectacle of seeing a really big, high-profile match as well, I think would have been very different to what Gaudier's talking about and observing in those training gyms.
So yeah, sure. Do you need the...
I don't think so. On that. Just on that point, which was something that I was thinking about, Steve, was how do you train for wrestling? Is it the case that you do these sort of repeated poses? Would you actually get into this double leg takedown pose and sort of, practice it? Do you return to poses, or is it more kind of a fluid match? I'm just trying to think whether this actually would have come out of something that he saw that was being repeated, and it was so recognisable for you in the work.
There's absolutely like primary positions that people are walking on depending on what the rules are. So each different type of wrestling is extraordinarily different. And what's happened, for example, nowadays is that we found out that wrestling and boxing are the most effective sports martial arts because you practice them as hard as you practice them in real life. So without denigrating any martial arts, I practiced as many as I could through my life. An art like Kung Fu, they say you'll kill someone with this touch, but you can't practice it because you'll kill someone. Whereas wrestling and boxing, when you hit someone sparring, it'll work when you do it on the street. And it's the same with wrestling. So people do technique breakdowns a lot, but it's actually primarily a sparring art, I think. So I definitely have been involved in classes where people just endlessly rep technique if they're very technical wrestlers, but also sparring, live recreations of the environment of competition are a huge part of it too, but I don't know in the period. But from what my grandfather, a huge part of the thing that my grandfather passed on is it's a really hard world, really savage world. And what was going on outside of the practicing in street fights, which we've all picked up if you watch films like Gangs of New York and stuff, things like fish hooking and eye gouging and a lot of that. And that really is in the style I was taught as a child. So it's interesting to see this, whether this is actually very clean freestyle wrestling. I think it is.
It's interesting in that article about the club that Gaudier went to, I think they said over half of the membership were from the police force. So it's kind of interesting again to kind of build up a picture of who was training there as well, and thinking about those people that he was looking at and training to be in the police. I think
Can I ask a question? Yes, can you shout as
Yes,
much as
I
you
will.
can? Or
I want to ask the art historian because what she thinks about this, because I'm interested that this is all coming up just before the First World War. So whether there was a sort of feeling of we need to train up now, And also, just going back to the turn of the century in England, you'd had the failure of the Boer War, and the knowledge that British men weren't tough enough. You know, what had come out of it was that they were emaciated, actually, the men had got to fight. So you had Bain and Powell training boys up in camping, and all those sort of pseudo-military skills. So it's just interesting to me that you also get this focus on wrestling coming up in the years up to the First World War. I wonder whether that's something that you've got any kind of a knowledge of.
Absolutely, I think that in that focus on combat and training is definitely something about a response to a crisis in masculinity that you mentioned, post the Boer War, and not having enough healthy, fit recruits to fight. So I think that's definitely part of that landscape of this interest. And thinking more specifically about Gaudier as well, being part of this avant-garde group of artists in London, some of the people I've mentioned, like Lewis and Pound, using this very masculine, virile rhetoric of being tough and using those terms about virility, masculinity, strength, toughness, force. I mean, force is a word that Gaudier uses and Pound use as well to describe technique, artistic technique. And so I think that that rhetoric as well, it sort of infuses the language of the pre-war avant-garde. So I think we can definitely bring those things together. Yeah, that's a interesting question.
I think there's one other observation you can make about the period that you're talking about, which is that the first modern Olympics in 1896, wrestling was part of the 1896 and subsequent Olympic Games. And in kind of most histories, I think, you know, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, histories of wrestling, there is this kind of purer moment of wrestling before the kind of cartels and promoters and gangsters get involved, which is after the First World War. So this moment from about 1896 to 1914 is a moment when there's a kind of wrestling, a kind of golden moment that's a real pocket, but also the pocket between the Boer War and the First World War. So it's a kind of really interesting kind of synergy of historical factors. So do you say anything about that moment of wrestling? You know, after that, I think for us it's very difficult to imagine that world of boxing because we're used to all the showmanship that came, you know, from the 1960s and 70s onwards, you know, with the slapping of the canvas and the sense that you were watching actors rather than athletes. Sorry,
yeah. I mean, or the little small thing I would add to that is that the transition between those worlds only really ended about 20 years ago. I mean, in Japan still, and in England still, if you don't know how to shoot, i.e. you don't know how to really wrestle, you're not really accepted on the professional wrestling circuit. That sounds kind of crazy because they are especially comedic and flamboyant in the UK when it comes to their pratfalling and the villains. But, you know, a lot of people nostalgize wrestling that I didn't get to grow up watching, but from the 70s, you know, Mick McManus, and these were hardcore shoot wrestlers, you know, who would snap people's arms and stuff. It's very, very famous for this, that you couldn't get in that sport without being a shoot fighter. So it's only in the last 20 years since all the muscle-bound dudes in America kind of took over that it's changed. So it was always kind of there. Still kind of is there a little bit. They still say people like The Undertaker or whatever, it's like he's a good shoot fighter, you know, still this, and they still have the carny language in wrestling. And who was interested in pro wrestling, I'm not really, but they still use work and babyface and heel and all these old school carny things, and it comes from catch wrestling.
And the country fair, I'm still quite, if you go to kind of the county fair in places up in Lancashire or Cumbria as well, and it's interesting the discussions around those arenas have been places where that's sort of a connection back to this this sort of prehistory of the pre-televised spectacle of wrestling as well. And I think that's probably a talk for another day, isn't it? But thinking about television and photography, which Lynn knows a lot more about than I do, the intersections between photography and boxing, but I think television and wrestling. And really for me, my first encounter with wrestling was eating cheese and pickle sandwiches with my granddad on a Saturday afternoon, watching the television, wrestling on the television, and the huge viewing figures for those Saturday afternoon matches, I mean, in the millions. So it's kind of interesting to think about these different moments of wrestling and the discussions that are sort of revived and happen around the events and the most recent Olympics, 2012 as well. I was lucky enough to go to some wrestling with Steve, and we're talking about that and the different discussions about, you know, where the sport is today as well. So I think these moments of redefinition, of thinking about its history, thinking about the artistic intersection with wrestling in the 21st century as well. I think there's a big project to do on that.
But actually, I think its Olympic status is under threat at the moment, isn't it?
It's just come back.
It's just come back, yeah. There was a vote that it should be excluded. Yes.
I think the discussion is absolutely fascinating because and I'm excited by the discussion of, you know, about, you know, physicality and the visceral nature of wrestling. But it seems a stretch. I mean, it seems a stretch to move from that conversation the same way that you were mentioning earlier, to move from Brzeska's excitement at the moment, and what he's doing here and what he's producing here, and I wonder whether we could talk a little bit more about his practice as an artist, because it seems to me that it is at least plausible to see wrestling as an incidental opportunity to play around with what was happening with abstraction. Because this is not a piece of work. That was interesting about your approach. It was almost diagrammatic approach to a particular wrestling move. But it seems to me not essentially to be about the body, you know. And so all of the discussion, which is about the body, which is about the violence, which is about, seems to run entirely counter to the experience of this. Yeah.
It is interesting to see it in these dimensions as well. That sort of in relief, and you know, imagining a different kind of depiction of two wrestlers in the round as well, which we get the wrestler figure, but we don't get. I mean, you see, maybe Redstone Dancer is the nearest that we get to that, but we don't, you know, we're seeing, I say, how do we look at these figures, and Lynn and I were talking before and thinking about the matness of this.
I think the sense that it comes from plaster of Paris is there in it. There's something dry and powdery.
And that it's in a frame
as
as
well. But I think somebody said earlier something about monumentality, about finding that moment of I can't remember what the word was, of stillness within the movement. Yeah. That starts getting close to, I think, what begins to happen here. But I don't think it's striven for, because there's a sort of very delicate wrapping and flopping that's going on. So the physicality, I think it's stretching the metaphors to talk about sort of the physicality of the making as being somehow embedded within the business of wrestling. It is a fact that it has been made. But I wonder whether he was trying to do something else. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. You know, what was his relationship to the art practice that was going on at the time, and how does the subject matter relate to that, if at all?
Well, I think, I mean, it like I said, this kind of idea of training to be a sculptor as well. I think that when he writes about what it is to sculpt, that it's written about as a very physical activity, and he's experimenting with a lot of different materials at this time. And this is not the only carved plaster piece as well. Bird swallowing a fish, I think I'm right, that's a carved plaster piece, isn't it? Carving the knuckle duster out of brass as well, that is very, very difficult to carve brass. So I think experimenting, and he's making his own chisels as well out of what he can get. I mean, there's an economics to this as well, that he's finding it very difficult to afford materials at this moment, and plaster is cheap. So he can, build it up. It's quick. He can build it up, and it's cheap. So I think that sort of there's that experimental quality to thinking what can he do here in plaster, which he's working with in other works that are dotted around the gallery as well. I don't know if you want to say anything about movement and stillness, because that's something we talked about actually when we were in front of quite a few years ago first, thinking about those moments of stopping, the pausing, and actually in a lot of the drawings as well, they're not all sort of tangled, knotty, grappling moments. There's kind of a pause between bodies. There's space, and there's that sort of the pregnant pause before the encounter. So I don't know if you want to say more about that.
I think all I would say is that I can definitely understand where you're coming from. I spent 7 years working at the British Museum looking at a lot of the classical renditions of wrestling, and I didn't find them to be technically accurate. I found them to be representations of male figures and homoeroticism. The messiness of this, the aesthetic quality of it struck me as that immediately. But it's still an interpretation. You could be 100% right, but that's all I would say to say it quickly, is that looks like what I've done. Whereas when I've watched these kind of arm lock figures, rippled, bearded figures, that moment of exhaustion and defence, the deadlock that's happening there, that's a moment of complete deadlock.
Oh yeah, no, I don't dispute the accuracy of it. It doesn't seem very visceral to me. That's the
right. I understand.
We have a few minutes more, but not very long. So I just want to give anyone the chance to, yes, at the back.
What he was doing with the art that he was making. So was he making just out of a sense convenient to create stuff, or were images like this, was he trying to sell them? Because as soon as you hear what is it Steven to say, you can almost say that it looks like a diagram from a textbook.
Mm.
So was he trying to create images that would help with the fighters, perhaps, or the wrestlers? Or what was he trying to do with the art?
I can't. Like I said, we don't know about this. It went into his kind of studio log of what he was making, and I say it remained in the studio until 1918, and that's the case with a lot of Gaudier's work. It was when he went to war in 1915, a lot of things remained in the studio. He was selling some of his work. He was making a lot of it for friends as well. Commissions, particularly Pound and Lewis and Fry, working with the Amiga group. So some of it was commissioned. So and like I said, the wrestler, the statuettes that Charles Wheeler commissions. We've got again a direct commissioned piece of work. So I mean that's you're sort of talking me into this now, or I'm talking myself into it, thinking about whether this also could have been a commission. That's highly, I think it's possible, and it's interesting to think about that, whether it does have a relationship to another person, and wasn't just a kind of a studio experimental piece as well. Jenny, do you have any, after working on all these?
Only that it's interesting to talk about in relation to the dancers as well, because there was, when he's writing about dance as a subject, he's certainly aware that it has a commercial potential. So he does say, I'm excited about the ballet roofs coming back, this is going to be great for me in terms of being able to make a living. And when you were talking about all the images that were in Illustrated News, the sketch magazine, sort of proliferating, it could be the case that, he also recognised that this was a popular subject, and it did have also that commercial potential. But it was certainly not only that, and I don't think it was a kind of incidental subject in his because, like I said at the beginning, he did very infrequently return to the same subject, and he did experiment with his abstraction through different forms, but only a few of them he really kind of interrogated. So for me, I sort of, those two interests I see as particularly kind of significant to his.
Yeah, particularly within these 2 years as well, with lots of dancing material as well. It's particularly between 1912 and 1914, isn't it? And of course, we have that moment of war, and then we will never know. But it sort of concentrates our focus as historians and curators into that very prolific moment, thinking about dance and wrestling in those two and a half years.
I think we're out of time, aren't we, Jenny? Yeah. We are out of time, but can you join me in thanking Sarah and Steven for two really wonderful and contrasting and complementary papers? And Jenny, then we go for a glass of wine. But can you join me in thanking them?
Again, from us as well. And